And we're going to talk a little Niners in this segment with Jordan Elliott from NBC Sports Bay Area, who's with us on the UMA guest line. Jordan, good to talk to you. Thanks for a few minutes.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure, Larry.
Well, what is your takeaway from this game against Kansas City? I mean, it's I really feel like the Niners have lost their swagger as a team, and I don't know if it's related to the fact that they can't beat the Chiefs or if it's more related to personnel and how much they miss a guy like Dre Greenlaw, but the Niners just seem like they like the Chiefs. They get along with the Chiefs. There's almost like this mutual admiration society thing going on, but it sickens me because I'd like somebody to put their foot down and just go, enough is enough. I hate these guys. I want to beat these guys. I'm not hearing that. It's a big kumbaya, but it's followed by, 6 straight defeats.
Larry, the biggest takeaway I had watching that game, and it's kind of been a theme all season, is that I just think that there was a margin for error that existed the last few seasons when the roster was a little bit deeper and there was a little bit more talent behind the front end guys, where they were able to make a couple critical mistakes in some big spots and they were able to overcome it just because of the amount of talent they had. I think that it gets lost in the shuffle that we saw a lot of, similar turnovers and things like that in recent seasons, but it gets lost in the shuffle when you end up winning those games. Now that they're not winning them, those mistakes are a lot more magnified. But even if we go to the third quarter on Sunday, it's 14-12. They're driving downfield. They had scored on 2 consecutive possessions. It looked like they were about to make it 3. And then on that 3rd and 6, deep in Kansas City territory, Brock throws that interception. And then the next Kansas City drive was when Mahomes has that just incredible run down the sideline. And the next thing you know, you go from having a chance to seize the momentum, go in front, and really be in control of this game to next thing you know, you're down 9 points and going up against one of the league's best defenses, if not the best defense, and you're down your top 3 receivers as well. So I just think it really comes down to the fact that they just don't have the room for error that they had before, and they're not able to overcome a lot of the adversity they've been doing in recent seasons. And I think it comes, again, back to the depth that's not there. You lose so many guys over the years, it's really hard to retain the depth. They've been able to retain the blue chip players for the most part, but when you lose guys like Azeez Al-Shaair, you lose guys like DJ Jones, you lose guys like Samson Ebukam, like over the years, like that starts to take its toll. And I think we're really seeing it manifest itself this season.
I think I totally agree with you. I do think their struggles, people blame Purdy, people blame Shanahan. And of course, that's par for the course. I think their struggles and their regression is tied to personnel. And, as you get further along in your regime with good players, and you start to pay them one by one, you're paying the top end of your roster a higher percentage of your total cap. So by definition, the rest of your roster is probably not going to be quite as good. And I think the Niners made a fundamental error. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think now it's abundantly clear it was a fundamental error. And that was their desire to trade it wasn't a trade necessarily, but it essentially was because of the cap. They traded a number of assets away for Javon Hargrave. And it kind of it took a situation where they probably needed to go the other way and try to lean into having more depth and greater depth. And instead, they, brought in Hargrave and kissed off a lot of their top-tier run defenders: Jimmy Ward, Emmanuel Mosley, Azeez Al-Shaair, Samson Ebukam, Hassan Ridgeway. I mean, we're talking about five pretty key guys on defense that all had to be kind of offloaded to fit in the Hargrave contract. And then Hargrave himself was more of a pass rusher and less of a run defender. And I just think you say goodbye to 5 kind of underrated run defenders and bring in a pass rusher who's not great against the run, and then all of a sudden you look up and it's like, what happened to the bedrock of this defense, the run defense side? They haven't stopped the run well in over a year.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, and I totally get what you're saying. I think the thing that I would maybe push back with there is, at the time, I thought it was a great move, and I still think that the real issue with it isn't necessarily like the fit or the players they lost. It's just the fact that, Hargrave got hurt down the stretch last season, played through injury, which I think, should be commended, the way that he was able to play through injury throughout the playoffs. And then obviously this season he had the season-ending injury. So he's not able to make that impact that we saw, I thought, very early on during the 2023 season when he first arrived here. there was a tangible difference in the amount of pressure they were able to generate up front. And not all of it was showing up with, sacks and stuff you'd see in a traditional box score. But going back and watching that defensive line film every single week, the amount of push that he was able to get inside with Eric Armstead, I could see the vision of what they had. And I think that when you're able to get after the opposing team's quarterback, that's obviously such a key fundamental, recipe for success. But when you're able to do it up the middle, I think that's something that's just such an underappreciated aspect of roster building, is when you're able to find those guys that can really dominate on the inside. And when you turn on his tape in 2022 with the Eagles, the guy was just incredible. And so I can understand their thinking where they're like, you know what, like, we have a pretty good D-line. Let's push the chips all in on this. We have Bosa commanding this much attention on the outside. We're going to get one-on-one somewhere with this defensive line. We have too much talent, and there's not enough, personnel on the other side to scheme against it where they can double everybody. So I totally get what you're saying. I think it is one of those things where it was a risk. You do risk some of the depth, and then when the player ends up getting hurt and they're not able to be out there, that's when you really start to feel the sting of it. Because I think had Hargrave stayed healthy and he was still out there, it does lessen the sting a little bit when you have a guy like that that's capable of playing like a Pro Bowler, which he has done during stretches as a 49er, in my opinion.
It's interesting. And you think about it, there's parallels in other sports. I mean, look at the Warriors. They kind of usurped their depth for Kevin Durant. They get into that finals with the Raptors, and suddenly there's a couple injuries, and now you sold your depth for stars. Your stars are hurt, and now suddenly you got nothing. You got absolutely nothing. And maybe I see the parallels there. McCole Hardman had a 55-yard punt return in this game. I'll tell you the other thing that was frustrating in this game is I kind of feel like the Niners had the momentum. They got the 55-yard field goal from Carlson. Despite the fact that Kansas City, really had dominated the first quarter, the Niners had a 3-0 early lead at the beginning of the second quarter. And then they have 3 penalties, including a 12-man on the field penalty on the next drive. And they kind of give, the Chiefs, who are also struggling in the red zone mightily, almost a free touchdown because they put them on the 1-yard line with some of those penalties. And sure enough, they get the touchdown. And then the Niners go 3 and out. Purdy throws a perfect dime on 3rd and 2 to Ayuk, who drops it. Would have been a great play. Instead, the Niners are punting, and Hardman runs it 55 yards back. And then the next play is 1st and 10, Chiefs on the Niner 30-yard line, and the Chiefs scored another touchdown. And suddenly, a game that the Niners had, pretty much not in hand, but they had they had some momentum. They're now down 14-3. What do you do special teams wise with Schneider? Do you make the hard? I mean, this is a hard thing to even discuss. I like this guy. I know lots of people around the NFL that feel that Schneider's a top tier special team coach. He's a tremendous guy. You can see Shanahan is trying to cover for him and is rooting for him and doesn't want to fire him. I don't want to see anybody lose their job, but there's massive breakdowns weekly with the special teams. How much longer can they go with Schneider?
Yeah, I think mid-season changes are always hard, especially when we're talking about special teams, right? Because I don't know who you would even slot into that. I don't think it's, a comparable thing to where if you're making an offensive or defensive coordinator change, or maybe there's a position coach that's comfortable calling plays and, organizing a unit. I think that's a much easier transition during the middle of the season. I think, honestly, the special teams issues, coaches will be held accountable and should be for, the units that they oversee. But really, at the end of the day, like, the players need to execute. And I do think that it comes back to what we've been talking about, right? Like, the depth isn't as good as it used to be. For so long, this 49ers roster was so good that a lot of the players on special teams, even if it wasn't a consistently great unit, they had a lot of guys that you could really rely on that had, been slotted into a special teams role for a number of years and knew their assignment. And they were able to be good enough that it wasn't entirely costing them games. Whereas now it feels like it's a weakness that can be exploited. And just like you mentioned, like in this game, you never want to lose the momentum of, extending a drive with a drop. When you have that drive that gets stalled out and then the first play right after is the other team getting the ball deep in your own territory before your defense even goes on the field, like, it feels like a gut punch. And I feel like this season, for whatever reason, whether it's the injuries, whether it's just the fatigue of being in these heavyweight games year after year, like, it just feels like it's a lot harder to bounce back from some of those, decisive blows that they're getting during games. Whereas before they could have, they might have shrugged that off and held the other team to a field goal, gotten the ball back and driven right downfield. Like there was always this sense of confidence that even those minor mishaps or major mistakes, even during games, that they would find a way to overcome them. And it just feels like this season, it's not what we've grown accustomed to. They've set such a high standard the last few seasons that when you see them struggle, it just seems like such a foreign thing because it just hasn't happened the last few years.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I know you're a guy that does watch film. And when the Niners lost on Christmas night to the Ravens, Kyle Van Noy the next day said, we didn't just beat the 49ers. We gave the rest of the NFL a blueprint on how to beat Brock Purdy. And since that game, or including that game, in his last 12 starts, the Purdy is 6-6 with 16 touchdowns and 14 turnovers. His first 21 starts, he had 47 touchdowns and 11 turnovers and was 18-3, but he's 6-6 in his last 12. I kind of scoff at the notion that they gave everybody a blueprint, but when I watched the film of Kansas City and the Niners on Sunday, what was pretty clear is that Kansas City on a number of routes chose to have inside leverage, where typically on a couple of these routes, outside leverage is the way the most of the league would play it. But it's clear they want to take away the middle of the field from the 49ers. Is it as simple as that the Niners need to adjust and start making plays outside the numbers to counter this? Did Baltimore create a recipe for how to beat Purdy and the Niners?
I don't believe so. I do think that their game plan was exceptional, and I think that the Chiefs' game plan this past week was exceptional, and you have to tip your cap. Spags, I think, is the best defensive coordinator in the league at this point. I think it's really hard to argue for anybody else. Some of those pressures, I don't know how deep you got into the film yet, but some of those pressures they were dialing up, I think even a seasoned quarterback that has more, people tend to forget that sometimes. I feel like that Purdy is in his third season and in his second season as a starter, like they were showing looks that would give a 10-year veteran a hard time. Like, I think that that's something that's really important to add to the context when we're having these discussions.
Absolutely.
I don't think necessarily like there's a blueprint. And I do think one thing with Purdy that gets lost in the shuffle a little bit, and I know that you notice this too, is he is really good throwing outside the numbers. He does have great anticipation when he's throwing these deep outs and he's throwing, beyond the sticks, downfield, outside the numbers. If anything, what I've kind of felt this season is that it seems like they're looking to stretch the field vertically almost too much. I do think that's one area where Purdy kind of gave them an additional, wrinkle to their offense that maybe wasn't there with his predecessor, where they were able to take shots up the seam. They were able to look downfield, and you had a guy that was going to take advantage of some of these explosives that had been there before, where guys were getting open downfield but weren't getting the ball. But I think because of that, it's almost like there's too much of an emphasis on that, and we're not seeing some of the checkdowns and some of the easy throws where, you may be foregoing the bigger play, but you're making the smarter play. And I think like that's an area where I'd be a little bit more concerned and something to keep an eye on going forward. Is it just like, as simple as Christian McCaffrey's not there and you have the safety blanket of a guy that you could check down to that could just make magic happen? Debo obviously didn't play much on Sunday. He I believe was just out there for a series or two in the first half. And you don't have that, run after the catch where you can check down and let the guy create like that. So I do think it is a little bit harder for this one game sample to, kind of judge Purdy on whether or not he was foregoing checkdowns too often. But I think over the course of the season, it is something you notice where it's like they're taking these shots downfield, which I think is good. And I think that they need to do so that teams don't load the box and so that teams aren't just jamming the middle of the field and taking over those, intermediate routes in between the middle of the field. But I also think that at the end of the day, like, when you have teams that are throwing these exotic pressures at you and you're having guys that are running free at you all the time, you're going to have to just get back to the basics, really lean in on throwing to your hot read and letting whoever's out there. Right now, it's not the guys you're accustomed to, but letting whoever's out there try to create after the catch and just trust that they're going to be able to make something happen. And it just feels like for whatever reason that disconnect kind of been the last few weeks.
Give me two names. Give me a name or two that you'd like to see the 49ers pull a trade for between now and the trade deadline. Are there two guys that you have interest in?
I think Harold Landry, if Tennessee is still having this, it seems like they're having they have a big garage sale sign in front of the facility there where they're like, hey, if you send us picks, we're open for business. I would love to see Harold Landry. I think he's an exceptional pass rusher. I think he's a guy
that you could slot in. I think Leonard Floyd has been great this year. I think Leonard Floyd's a guy that is exactly what they were looking for and what they needed, just a consistent, reliable option opposite of Nick Bosa. But I also think that the way that the season has gone and the way that they've been depleted with some of these injuries, like they really need some depth on that defensive line. And I think adding a guy like Landry would do wonders for them. So he's definitely a guy I would target. And then I don't think they need a receiver really, but I do think that it could be interesting if Cleveland's willing to move David Njoku, the tight end. I would really, really like to see that move made. I don't know necessarily if the 49ers would do it because I think he's a guy where maybe he doesn't fit into the long-term plans due to the money that he would be, receiving and the contract that he'd ultimately get. But I think getting Njoku out there and then starting to lean more into some heavy personnel and having him and Kittle out there at the same time, and I think it not only would open up things for them in the pass game, but I think it would really help them a little bit more dynamic.
I like that. Yeah, I like that idea. I like that idea because if you could get a second tight end of substance like that, you could almost force teams to play you in their base, and then you could probably start to pick on them a little bit better and make bigger plays. Instead of a team throwing, putting their nickel or dime out there. If you get the two tight end look, you can almost guarantee that you could kind of dictate teams, and if you want a team in their base defense, you could see more of that if you had a second tight end of note. I kind of like that name, David Njoku. Very talented, kind of an underrated guy. Jordan, great stuff. You're a great follow at Splash Cousin on X, and tell people if they want to get a hold of you, where and when they can digest your content on the 49ers.
Yeah, I'm always available on Twitter. I try to post as much as I can there, and then also sportsbayarea.com. I actually I posted a story this morning. I talked with Dominick Puni, and I don't know if you knew this, Puni grew up a huge Warriors fan. Steph Curry's his favorite player, so that's something that a lot of people here in the Bay Area can relate to. And as I'm sure you know, Larry, speaking with him, he's very professional, carries himself very well. It's shocking for somebody who's so new to the NFL, the way he carries himself. And he actually told me that a lot of that was inspired by Steph and the way that Steph carries himself and how he deals with media and how he doesn't waver whether they win or lose. He's always very direct and always willing to step up and handle himself like a professional. So I wrote a story on the connection between Puni and Curry and how that, how him watching Steph, really take over this market is helping him author his own legacy here in the Bay Area. So if you guys want to check that out, it's at NBCSportsBayArea.com.
I'll look for that. I absolutely love that. It's a hokey saying, but I'll say it because it fits for Dom Puni. Dom Puni is good people. He is a good dude. He really a great, engaging young guy and smart, competitive. I mean, they hit on that one. That was a great pick with Dom Puni in round 3. Jordan, great stuff, man. Thanks for coming on KNBR. We appreciate you. We'll hopefully see you down at the facility in the next couple weeks, and we wish you nothing but success and great things ahead. Thanks again.